Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Enterprise Data Summit. I am Eric Gonzalez, VP of Business Intelligence Architecture over at Eastern Bank, and I'm excited to be here today to talk about data leadership and the current state of data leaders. And I'm joined by two fabulous panelists. Go ahead and let them introduce themselves. John, if you want to go first.
Sure. Hey, I'm John Steinmetz. I'm VP of Data over here at Shiftkey. We're kind of like what you would call the Uber for nurses and CNAs. And I've been at Shiftkey for about 2 years, primarily focused in the data and analytics space for the last maybe 15. Was an engineer for a good while, but looking forward to talking to you guys a little bit about the teams we run and how we run them.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Keyur?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Keyur Desai. I am the former Chief Data Officer at TD Ameritrade prior to its acquisition by Charles Schwab. And I've been doing data analytics and artificial intelligence for the last 30 years. So excited to be here speaking with my fellow colleague, John, and yourself, Eric.
Awesome. Well, the first thing I wanted to talk about with you both is it seems like every day there's a new tool being released, another round of layoffs, and different adverse macroeconomic conditions that is impacting the overall industry, but especially the data industry. And so from your perspective at Shiftkey, John, how have these uncertain times, impacted the data org, and what have you done to adapt to them?
Absolutely. There's a lot of fear across the industry right now, like you said about the layoffs and, all the new technologies that are coming up. The key for us has always been on focusing on scalability, like making sure we scale the people we have. Some of that includes those tools. It really means making them more flexible in their roles. Sometimes we give people additional responsibilities that are more aligned to their likes and, what they want to do. The morale is a really important component. You get a lot more productivity out of the people if their morale is high, and it's really hard right now to keep that. But what I try to do is, even though I'm at the VP level, I try to meet with each one of my people on a regular cadence, just popping in to see what they're and taking the emotional pulse of the team. That's a really critical component. You know, the other part of this is that work has kind of transitioned to this remote work environment. When you're in person, it's a lot more personable. It's a lot easier to kind of reach into somebody's brain and get into their face and kind of be a little bit more attentive to their needs. But it really gets hard to do it behind a screen. You just have to change your service, right? You have to change how you service that model. And one of the biggest things on that is transparency with me. The more transparent I can be with my people about how the business is running, where we're going, usually it makes for a much more grounded team, as far as like they're more likely to ask the right questions to you so that you can get more out of them as far as like their emotional state, and making sure that that is a big component to everything that I do is that transparency. You don't always get it right, but if you can get them to talk about what's bothering them, and you can be more transparent about the answers to that, usually that'll go a long way.
Yeah, and I think that helps with fear, definitely, is being able to be interpersonal, and you have to manufacture those connections because, to your point, being behind the screen, being a remote workforce, it's more difficult to obviously have those water cooler talks or those off the cuff chats that you would have maybe walking to lunch or walking to get coffee. And so having those one-on-ones, I'm sure, goes a long way, and especially during these uncertain times like we were talking about. Keyur, how about for you? How have you been able to adapt to them?
Yeah, so, where I play is mostly, large corporations, you're talking about 10,000, 15,000 employees, publicly traded. And the way I've seen my role is that I've really got two constituents that I'm trying to cater to, right? One is the business side and then their leadership. And then number two, of course, just like John said, is my own team, right? Which is globally distributed. And so if you just look at the business side, right, in times of uncertainty, I'm of the belief that there's no bigger way to bring about certainty for a business than to look at your data, right? And so I've always regarded, and this goes back my entire 30-year career, all the way from the dot-com crash through 2009 through to 2020, all these difficult moments we've had in our economy, data has always shown in those times. And so I use these opportunities to really work with the business to get them over the hump, to get to help them understand exactly the value data analytics can bring to them, right? And these are times when that are best served to change mindsets on the business side in terms of the value of data and analytics. So how can data help them improve revenue in times of uncertainty? How can it help decrease their costs? How can it help them improve profitability? How can it help them reduce risk, right? So these are the types of conversations I have with the business side. Now, when it comes to my own team in times of uncertainty, right? One thing to realize is that just when times get uncertain is when you need your team to be the most committed, right? And so how do you actually drive that commitment? And a lot of it, a lot of what John said resonates. But, the one thing that's really worked for me is ensuring that we clarify the purpose of an individual's role and a team's role with regards to meeting specific business outcomes on the business side. Because once you understand the purpose and more importantly, identify with that purpose, it really makes you resilient no matter what challenges are thrown your way. So I've always found that clarifying that purpose is key, above and beyond a lot of things that John spoke about, which are very appropriate.
Yeah. And I think that also just helps all the employees and the team members as well. As to your point, it might be uncertain times, but there is certainty within your role and understanding what it is that you're trying to do, what the mission of the company is, and how you will be a unified force getting there. But I want to click into something that you said, and it's that you're straddling both the business and the data or tech teams. And commonly, I think there's a misconception that the data org is a function of technology or that it doesn't really have anything to do with business, even though we all probably would agree that data are as important for business, if not more important for the business than technology at times. And so to become truly data-driven as an organization, there needs to be a good, solid communication layer between the business and tech teams, usually with data as a conduit. And so from your perspective, Keyur, as you just talked about with your role in bridging that gap, how have you served as the glue between those two, or how have you bridged that gap for yourself as well as for your team?
Yeah, really, really important question, right? And this has sort of been a struggle, but we are making progress and have made progress over the last 30 years that I've been doing this. But it really comes down to one thing, right? In terms of being that glue, it's vital that the business side understands that there's more to data analytics than reporting, okay? Data and analytics, to really, really see a step change in the performance of a corporation, data and analytics can be used to automate processes, improve human capabilities, reduce risk, improve customer experience, create data products, improve products, right? And if you are able to open the eyes of business leaders as they are beginning to discuss their business strategy, and you're present over there, helping them understand how data analytics can play in these 6 areas, right? Then you've really started this snowball effect to where let's start something small with a certain line of business. And these are initiatives that I would help lead in terms of translating what they're trying to do on the business side and in trying to achieve specific outcomes. And then, what I would do is help them translate how data analytics can actually help that business outcome. So it's a collaborative effort. It's a collaborative exercise between the business and my teams to at least get started with me leading, okay? But what happens is that to really scale and ensure that data analytics plays a role across the organization to allow that step change in performance, it's important that everyone in the business becomes adept at ensuring that they can translate their business outcomes into how data analytics can help them. So the key is we have to scale this ability, and this comes about through some organizational changes where you can embed data strategists within organizations to help those lines of business actually understand how data and analytics can help their business change. And more importantly, quantify that impact. At the end of the day, data clarifies everything. So if you can clarify the impact of their revenue of this particular idea, you start getting people, over to your side in terms of data can really help us. But make no mistake, it is one of the hardest things we do in our jobs, is helping the business truly understand what's possible with data and analytics.
Yeah. And it's understand what's possible, but also to obtain that buy-in. And so I often joke that I'm bilingual between business and tech or business and data, because you really do have to speak two separate languages of being able to understand the business outcome and split that out or break that down into the technical components for a build, but then also be able to take that data, extract the value, and make it usable, understandable, and ultimately derive that business value for those stakeholders. And so every data project is not just about the ones and zeros, but it's really about driving that organizational change management that you alluded to, Keyur, of actually having buy-in from the business, delivering those data products, and then seeing the operational improvements from that. I want to stay on that thread of business, tech, and data, but shift over to you, John, to talk about how do you empower your team members to approach the business or to work with the business and to work cross-functionally across all of those groups to ensure that you're building out those products well, but also bridging that communication gap?
Yeah, I mean, to Kara's point about embedding the teams within those constructs, and understanding where the business is at that moment. If the business doesn't have a strong product team, you embed them with the departments and make sure the departments understand. I mean, everybody who's probably watching this has known what like from a financial perspective, it's really hard to work with, teams that have Excel documents floating around everywhere, right? How do you get those teams to buy in that there is a better way? And there is, the data team should be looking at things from not just a reporting perspective, right? How do you get your people to ask better questions? When I say your people, I just mean the data team itself, has to be able to know, to be able to reason out what people are asking for and say, what's the purpose of this thing you're trying to accomplish? Or else you become a reporting team. And a reporting team is a cost center, whereas an insight team is a profit center, because that's where innovation is born. And that's where all of these components that we try to do, building out, analytics services that are embedded in teams. It might not be a person. It might be something your team's building that gets embedded as part of the process. Or a daily use component, more than just the dashboard. I'm talking about recommendation engines and all of these really high-end analytic components. That's really what you have to do, is you have to start to teach your team about what their capabilities are. Because if they feel like a reporting person, they will act like a reporting person. And we have to empower them to be able to say no. And in a way that's that's probably we got to look at it a different way, right? That's a good way of saying no to something without telling the person they're not getting what they want. Because you're typically born into a data team as a service-oriented organization. And what the reality is, data leads a lot of these conversations. And if we're brought in as a bookend, it's a lot better for the business, as opposed to being brought in at the end to say, tell me how this did, right? Every company goes through that maturity. Usually every company goes through that type of maturity stage where they go from the people on the data team being, tell me how the success of this particular thing. And instead, now we're embedded at the beginning. How can we instrument this to determine the success metrics, and what should we be looking at? Because you have the context. And when I say you, I mean my team. They have the context that spans the entire company. Many times they know how things interact, whereas you get these business owners who truly only understand what they're doing, and it's very isolated and compartmentalized. So that's what I would say, is just empowering our teams to be able to learn how to say no in the right ways, and stop answering a question and start helping people ask better questions. I think that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. And a lot of times you have business stakeholders who come in and they have these like horse blinders on to the products that they've seen before, to these legacy platforms that they used before. And when you get new functions, you get new resources, or you get new tools, well, now there's a different way of doing things, and there's a different way of thinking about things. But to your point, if somebody just goes in as an order taker and it's like, hey, we have this Excel report, now we want to see that in Power BI, or we have this SSIS package, now we want it built out in a different workflow product. You now recreate the same problems or recreate the same questions that were limiting, and you don't allow for that product tool person to expand the organization or to expand the way that you intended it to. So to your point, it's about trying to be effective as a group, but being effective by not necessarily saying no, but let's think about this differently. So we talked a little bit about the effectiveness of these groups, or being able to be effective at a high level as a data org. John, from your perspective, when you think about your teams and seeing their growth and maturation over time, how have you been able to measure their effectiveness for the organization? What are some of those things that internally you use as KPIs or different metrics to determine, hey, we've grown as a group, or we've grown as an org to the level that we needed to get to?
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting question in that a lot of companies do it differently. Legacy companies will look at output as a measure of effectiveness, and I completely have a different perspective. I look at outcomes as the, it seems kind of cliche that everybody's talking about outcomes, but ideally, what you should care more about is how effective is my team at creating business value. Right? Not how many tickets they produce or how many things they do. It's really about what the effectiveness of those particular items are. And it comes down to two things. What is the efficiency of the task that they're completing, and what is the value of the task, right? You can throw these on any kind of like chart you want, as far as like, your typical, Eisenhower charts, as far as like, priority and level of effort and stuff like that. But I try to get my teams to understand when they look at what they do is, does this relate to something that the business cares about? What are the high level KPIs? Like, if you're being effective, you're affecting one of those KPIs in some way. How do we break those down into the things you do every day? You don't always have alignment on what that is. That's the challenge that we deal with, because as a data team, there are things we know that we should be doing, but the business could care less about them. But we know that those things unlock the 10 other things that they do want to do, right? So it's really it's about negotiation, and it's about understanding how do we balance our time to bring these things in to produce the next level of analytics capabilities to unlock the next big things that they want to do. Higher level at the board or at the business level, I've created a proprietary framework that I use to determine the value of a data point, and that encompasses all of the different components of what we do. Things like how many reports are we generating versus how many are actually being used. That's a level of efficiency a lot of people miss. They don't realize, next thing you know, you got 500 reports that people have built, and people only use like 10. So why are those reports there? They're creating confusion, number one, so remove them, right? Sometimes the efficiency aspect of what we do is removing complexity or redundant information. Another thing could be how hard is it to get a piece of data from one place in the system to another, right? And we roll that into a number. It's usually a dollar amount of the value of the data in our company. And it's a pretty good gauge, because once you start getting more efficient in what you do, all of a sudden that number starts to raise as the value of that dollar per data point starts to raise, and you start to see that the level of effort that you're putting in is actually impacting the value of what you do. That's more at the high level, though. From an effectiveness, it's a tactical thing. Sometimes with teams to try to figure out, like, are they working on the right things? We're in a position right now where we're evolving to this next level company, and we're trying to get people to understand that you don't always have to do everything that's in that queue. You have to prioritize it against the biggest business value items. And we're making those changes today, and we're seeing the fruits of that labor pay off based on the outcomes, not the output, but the outcomes that we're seeing.
Yeah. And I think when you get into output versus outcome, you're getting into the quantity versus quality argument. And when you're developing excessive amounts of reports, models, tools, frameworks, et cetera, you're number one, like you said, introducing confusion. You're number two, potentially introducing a lot of tech debt that you're not going to be able to resolve on the back end because you just need to keep developing that new thing. But also you're incurring a ton of cost that data is being persisted somewhere else. You need to have additional licenses or additional pieces to look at for each of the tools that you're building. And so, like you said, yes, introduces a lot of confusion for the business and then overall decreases the actual value of the output that you have. But I think it also has some deleterious effects both to the organization's bottom line as well as to the individuals that are producing those products. How about you, for you, Keyur? What have you seen or what have you used to measure the impact and effectiveness of groups?
Yeah, so for us, it really quite simplistically comes down to one idea, that at the end of the day, data and analytics helps a company improve its performance, in a step change type of an effect. These are not small changes, these are massive. And so we measure our performance and our contributions to the company using 4 high-level KPIs. First is improvement in revenue. Second, decreasing cost. Third, improvement in profits. And lastly, reduction in risk, which, by the way, risk can actually be quantified. So that's how we measure our contributions to the company. And it's vital that we do it that way because one of the hardest things as a data team is to acquire additional funding. And so once you're able to tell the funding authorities, be it the board or the executive team or the CFO, the impact that your group has had, right, with a certain amount of funding in the past, it's very easy to then justify an increase in funds going forward. And just in terms of scale, I mean, typical budgets that I'm dealing with are between $50 and $60 million a year, right? And to keep that justified, you need to make sure you are razor focused on those 3 metrics that can be quantified.
Yeah. And, I think to your point, measuring all of those, it also gets back to what John's talking about, and you're measuring the outcomes and you're not just measuring the output. And those 4 key elements really do tie to whether or not you're successful as a data function. And so everything we've talked about is regarding data's importance in today's world. But while data have always been there, and Keyur, you were talking earlier about, through all these different economic cycles, for all these uncertain times, whether it's right now or in the past, data has been that thing that has driven organizations forward. But I don't think everybody has always thought of data in that light. And I don't think that people have also carved out data within organizations to that degree. And even data leadership is something that is continuously changing, evolving, and maturing. You have a lot of CDOs, CDAOs that don't report to the CEO and report as a function of different groups. So there's still a lot of work, I think, to be done. But Keyur, from your perspective, how has, from your early days of data leadership to now, the role of a data leader or data leadership as a part of the org evolved?
Yeah, it's a question that's near and dear to my heart, right? I've been in this space 30 years, actually 30 years in January. And when I started, there was no industry or data analytics industry, right? We were essentially, in a software space, a subcategory of software. And back then, I'm talking the early 90s, we were just trying to propagate the message that democratization of data can add value to a company. And these were times when people were using green bar reports to actually effectively run massive, multi-billion-dollar corporations. Okay. And there's a couple key years where I think we've made meaningful progress towards moving towards the ultimate goal of creating a data-driven organization, right? And fortunately, these changes are now accelerating, which is good to see, but it's been a long slog. The first The first year where I think we saw sort of a seminal change was around 2000s, right? And this is when the internet came to be, and people started to recognize that these internet companies were making money with data. Why can't we? And what we started to see was these traditional corporations like, oil and gas companies, electric utilities, financial services industries, creating data groups within application teams or, new groups underneath the CIO. And that was great because it started to really formalize the idea that data could just be important to a corporation. And so companies started to dabble in it in about the 2000 timeframe. And funnily enough, back to my earlier statement around, crashes are when data becomes most important. Guess what? 2000 is when we had that .com crash, right? And people started to really want to lean on data as an asset. And then 2009 came about, another crash year, right? When regulations came to be. And that's when the role of CDOs, chief data officers, were first formalized within banks to actually help regulate a lot of the data environments over there. 2011 was another seminal year for me where, Watson won Jeopardy, and that really opened up the eyes of many executives that, wait a minute, we could actually use data for good analytical purposes. And that's where CDO mandates expanded from defense to offense, saying, help us really understand how to use data to create change in a company. And then 2020, year of digital acceleration, right? Where we got like 10 years of acceleration in a year, is when executive teams really started to wake up to the idea of using data as an asset, otherwise they'll be left behind. And I would say 2020 to 2022 is when the role of the CDO or something like that in corporations, a data leader, started to really accelerate. So we're just starting to see things accelerate. I'd like to see a CDO really become a core part of the executive team because you need to be part of those strategic conversations. But I am optimistic that over the last 30 years, we've made changes in the right direction.
Yeah. And, what you're talking about is recessions bring innovation, and a lot of innovation has happened around the data role or data leader role in organizations. But to your point, there's definitely still some improvements to be made. John, how about for you? I know that I think, looking at your profile, you didn't start necessarily in data. I saw you were a graphic designer first, and then you got into data leadership about a little over a decade ago at the W2O group. And so from then until now, also for you, how have you seen it evolve? But also to, I guess, build on Keyur's point, where are some areas that you think data leadership needs to improve as a whole for the marketplace?
Yeah, I would say 2000 was a very big year for us too in the data world, or as in the development world with the year 2000 crash and the Y2K bug and stuff like that. That actually was a whole lot of precursor to people saying, let's look at what this problem will be. And they ran a whole bunch of models and data simulations to see what the problems would be. I think that exposed the industry, the software and tech industry, to how data could be used to expose problems as opposed to show them after the fact. And that also roughly 2008 to 2012, social media really blew up and expanded the level of data that you could mine through user behaviors and influencing behavior. It became less about looking back and more about looking forward. I worked with a lot of brands, Nike, Johnson & Johnson, Adidas, a lot of those brands that really wanted to say, I don't care about today. I want to know how I can get the next generation or the next influencers to support data. So I think that's really what I saw coming through. What I would say as far as what people could do better is embracing the rapidly changing AI world. AI is a very loaded term, I get it, but you got to get on board, you got to learn, you got to understand at a very broad level what these items are, and don't just talk about them. You know what I'm saying? A lot of people just talk about them in the sense of what they are and how important they are, but they don't really understand what it's going to take to get there or what they can be used from a business value. So that would be one of the biggest things I would tell leaders today is just understand the scope of what you're asking people to look into, and figure out a way to create business value quickly at a small scale and grow your business value into that space. That's really what I would say is probably the one thing is that rapidly changing environment. Be sure you're aware of those things.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too, to build on that, is like data is an investment, and the data leader role and data org for a company is an investment. And I think sometimes people see the innovation that's happening around them as we can get something immediate, and there's this immediacy pressure to get or derive value from it. But just like any org, it takes time. It takes time to build, to plant the seeds, to flourish. And so to your point, it's, building these products, starting with something small, but being patient through the process and trusting the process that eventually will achieve those outcomes that you both have outlined. But I think we're at time today. So I want to thank you both for joining me, and thanks Solution Monday for having us at the Enterprise Data Summit. I'm available on LinkedIn for anybody to connect at EG Data Guy. And I think we both will have your connections within the show notes as well. So thank you, John. Thank you, Keyur.
Pleasure. Nice.